and just say hello to you. How are you today, Tony?
I'm doing well, and we should also say thank you to Hercules for allowing this to happen.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much in advance, Hercules. And we really definitely appreciate it. And Tony, how are you doing today?
Doing really well. I'm very excited to have Apollonius on the show today. Apollonius also
Ah,
done Opsopaus PhD and Bruce MacLennan PhD.
fabulous, fabulous. And you guys are going to be discussing a wide range of topics. We cannot wait to get into it. So I will let you guys begin. Have a wonderful interview.
Okay, so specifically, we're going to be talking about Apollonius's latest book, Pythagorean Theology and the Esoteric Elements. I reviewed this book for my Patheos blog, Holistic Spirituality, November 2023, and wanted to learn a little bit more about it. But first, we should have a look at Apollonius's background. Apollonius has practiced magic, divination, and neo-paganism since the 1960s. He has more than 30 publications in various magical and neo-pagan magazines, and designed the Pythagorean Tarot and wrote the Comprehensive Guide to the Pythagorean Tarot, The Wisdom of Hypatia, Ancient Spiritual Practices for a More Meaningful Life, The Oracles of Apollo, The Secret Texts of Hellenic Polytheism, a Practical Guide to the Restored Pagan Religion of George Gemistos Plethon, as well as the Tablet of Thebes, with illustrations adapted from Hans Holbein the Younger. Apollonius frequently presents workshops on Hellenic magic and neo-paganism, Pythagorean theology, divination, and related topics. He is a member of the Great Council and is past dean of the departments of mathemagics and ceremonial magic of the Grey School of Wizardry. Apollonius was a third circle member of the Church of All Worlds, past coordinator of the Scholars Guild for the Church of All Worlds, and past archon of the Hellenic Kin of ADF, which stands for A. George Fellowship. He is also a university professor and with more than 25 years of experience reading ancient Greek and Latin. Apollonius, thank you so much for making yourself available and coming on the show. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, and thank you for that very nice introduction. Um, so yeah, it's quiet. I've retired now, so life's much less hectic than it used to be. So.
I'm not so sure if it's much less hectic because book, so I think you're probably just as busy, if not more so, than when you were tenured.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, I was actually just thinking about it earlier today. I spend as many hours working each day. I mean, pretty much all my waking hours. But it's all what I want to work on at this stage. So what I think is important and what I'm most interested in working on. So it's nice. I highly recommend it.
Exactly. And plus, now you're leaving a legacy not just for your students, but for the greater world at large.
Well, that's what I hope. I hope that this material will be out there and that people will be able to get it. Because a lot of my stuff is on the web. It has been since the early 1990s. But the web is a strange place. It's stuff is archived, but on the other hand, websites come and go, and even standards change. Some character set standards and other things change. So there's a lot to be said for books.
Absolutely. So I was going to say that I really enjoyed your latest book, Pythagorean Theology and the Esoteric Elements. Regarding the context of your text, you wrote that, quote, these are extended versions of a series of articles published in Circle Network News from 2002 to 2004. So I was wondering about the differences between the original articles and their current form as you've just published.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. There's not a huge difference. Actually, some of the first articles, the ones on the esoteric elements, I wrote in the 1990s, also for Circle Network News. And so you have, with all of these articles, I think there were 10 originally, spanning over a decade, really. And So a lot of what I was doing was just editing, bringing a few things up to date, but also making them consistent. So, I had some stylistic differences I did in the different articles, and even the ways I transliterated Greek and things like that. So a lot of it was making it consistent and then putting in cross references. There are an enormous number of cross references in the book, and because the articles all refer to each other,
Mm.
I had in the online version, I had some links between the different pages, but in the book, I wanted to make that much more systematic to show it really is um, an integrated system of ideas. Originally, I mean, in my mind and in my notebooks and everything, they were all integrated, but then I split them up to publish them back in the 90s and the 2000s.
Wow. Could you tell us about the importance of Pythagoras outside of his contributions to mathematics? I mean, all of us had experience with Pythagoras's theorems of triangles and the like in high school math. So I was wondering about the contributions of Pythagoras outside mathematics.
Right. And, I would in fact argue that his contributions outside mathematics were much more important than his contributions in mathematics. I mean, historians will tell you that, certainly in other cultures and maybe even in Greece, the Pythagorean theorem was probably known before Pythagoras. And the experiments he's supposed to have done on the ratios of strings and the different tones they produce. The way it's normally described in history, it was actually not with the length of the strings, but with weights. And again, physicists will tell you that doesn't work. So the stories are somewhat apocryphal, but nevertheless, they were important in terms of suggesting, especially in the Western world, that the physical world, the messy physical world in which everything is changing and things seem to be unpredictable, uh, could be described mathematically, and that there were deeper mathematical principles underneath the kind of chaos and complexity that we see in the world around us. But again, I would argue that is not really his most important contributions. What Pythagoras did was that in the 6th century, he, having, according to the biographies we've got, which are really legends, but they're biographies, but it's hard to say how much they're true. But according to these stories, he visited all of the various philosophers and teachers around the Mediterranean, Egypt, uh, Babylonia, Chaldea, um, uh, Greece, of course, and all around the Mediterranean, Phoenicians, and he learned their mysteries, um, which was not, again, too uncommon for intellectuals at that time. You'd make this sort of grand tour around the Mediterranean and study from whoever would permit you to study with them.
Mm.
And he later settled down in Italy and founded a brotherhood, it's normally called, although it admitted women as well as men. So an organization. Um, we might call it a secret organization because you had to be initiated into it. There was a sort of a probationary period of 5 years, it's claimed. And then you would begin to learn the inner teachings of this order. And so Pythagoras taught mysteries, Pythagorean mysteries, orally, as far as we know, in this school. And they also, this was not just an esoteric order. It was in some ways like the Rosicrucians, several millennia later, that they were interested in how to live and also how to organize society. And so they would come into an area and they would Pythagoras would give lectures to the different groups of people, the men, the women, the young people, and try and convince them how they should live their lives. Of course, the specialists, they would join his order, and if they were admitted, they would then learn the inner teachings, the secret, so to speak. But they had public teachings about how to conduct life, how to do sacrifices. So both religious and political types of organization. And this, you know, in this way, they were able to reform society, but also they made a lot of enemies too, because the aristocrats and the oligarchs of the time did not like these people coming in with their strange ideas and convincing people of them. So Pythagoras formed this brotherhood, and it lasted for a while. Because of the reaction against it, it was sort of dispersed, and we actually don't know what happened to Pythagoras, whether he was killed in one of the revolts against the Pythagoreans, or whether he escaped, or what happened to him. So that's part of the mystery, is we don't know what happened to Pythagoras. But Pythagoras also, some of the things we do know from the stories about Pythagoras and from later teachings, is he really fits the description of what we would now call a shaman. He showed many of the characteristic behaviors that we associate with shamanism. For instance, bilocation. He would be witnessed in several different places, hundreds of miles apart at the same time. He remembered his previous lives. He believed in reincarnation. That was a characteristic Pythagorean belief. Vegetarianism was another part of the Pythagorean teachings. So this is why I say the mathematics is sort of incidental to all of this. It was really a spiritual tradition that he was initiated, perhaps, but certainly he founded at least one version of it, and then many people that came after him. Again, all oral teachings. He taught incubation as a way of contacting the gods and communicating with them. He taught a method of divination based on numbers, probably not what usually goes under the name Pythagorean numerology these days, but some sort of divination based on numbers. He did a kind of soul retrieval, you know. So all of these sorts of spiritual practices, he seems to have been one of the main conduits of these ideas into ancient Greek society. There doesn't seem to have been too much of these, what you might call shamanistic types of activities before Pythagoras. And one speculation is that some of these ideas began to enter the Greek world around 700 BCE, when the Greeks came in contact with shamans in the narrower sense around the Black Sea. And so these ideas were finding their way into Greece from the East, and Pythagoras in particular founded this system of beliefs based on them, developing it on his own. And there's a whole other interesting story about some of Pythagoras's contacts with other types of spiritual practitioners. But in any case, an important part about Pythagoras's teachings were a sort of sacred numbers that he identified. He said the numbers were gods, and so there was a close connection between numbers and gods. And when I say numbers, I mean the first 10 numbers. And so this, of course, connected then with some of his more, you might say, more scientific or more applied use of numbers. But really, from a spiritual perspective, the most important part was his view that the gods were numbers, and that numbers were divine, which then would tie into his use of numerology as well as a method of divination. So in a philosophical context and in a spiritual context, when we talk about Pythagoreanism, we're usually talking about him as a founder of a spiritual tradition that was oral for many, many years. The first Pythagorean writings were written down in the time of Plato. And then there's later writings by Pythagoreans. Now, but this raises interesting questions about, well, is this really what Pythagoras taught or not? One of the complications is because he was treated as such a literally a semi-divine being. The Pythagoreans said there are mortals, there are gods, and then there's him. In other words, he was something special, all his own. And the Latin phrase "ipsi dixit," he himself said it. That was sort of the catchphrase in Pythagoreanism is that Pythagoras himself had said something, and it was really unquestionable after that. So he was an enormous authority figure. But as a result of that, later Pythagoreans, when they would write stuff down, they would attribute it to Pythagoras. So we have all of these documents that are attributed to Pythagoras or sometimes to other early Pythagoreans. And, sometimes they're obviously not, because you can tell from the language that they're much later. But do they reflect actual Pythagorean ideas? Well, it's hard to tell sometimes. But as far as we know, we don't have any actual authentic writings from Pythagoras, probably because he didn't write anything down. And but there's lots. Then he forms this whole tradition, which was very influential on Plato, very influential in Middle Platonism, and then later in Neoplatonism and also Neo-Pythagoreanism. So these Pythagorean ideas are just very, very influential in that whole strand of Greek philosophy and spirituality, which then, of course, finds its way into other strands of Western European and Mediterranean, for that matter, spirituality.
I was wondering if you could give us a brief summary of the theology of Pythagoreanism. And one thing that jumped out at me was that you said that Pythagoras considered the first 10 numbers to be divine. So that seems to tie in with the 10 Sephiroth on the Tree of Life in the Kabbalah. So I was wondering how much influence of Pythagoreanism, sorry, it was hard to get out, there was in the Kabbalah.
Yes, from what I've read from scholars of the Kabbalah, that there was an infusion of Pythagoreanism into it. I don't know, I think maybe somewhere around the year 1000, so maybe late Middle Ages. So interestingly enough, especially after the Christianization of the Roman Empire, a lot of these ideas went underground, and in particular, they became very popular further east. So among Jews, also among Arabs, and there was many translations and applications of Pythagorean ideas in the East, in the Middle East, which were then brought back into Europe later, with especially with Arab invasions. There's a sort of a rich ferment of ideas as people saw some of the Pythagorean insights and found them very valuable, but then were applying them in their own cultural or religious context. And I think that's what we see in the Kabbalah in particular.
When you covered the theogony or the birth of the gods, you pointed out that you were offering a synthesis of the systems of the Pythagoreans, the Neo-Pythagoreans, and the Neoplatonists, despite the fact that they differed on many technical points of their philosophy. So that to me seems to imply that you're saying that while theory is important, it's much less important than praxis.
Yes, I believe that's true. And that would be a typical ancient Greek idea, that orthopraxy is more important than orthodoxy. So what you believed was not so important as what you did. The other thing is, especially if you think about the origins of Pythagoreanism, it really comes from things like shamanic journeys, from theurgy, from incubation. So it's these kind of mystical processes where you come in contact with the gods and try and have some actual experience of the structure of the divine realms. And you know, if you think about that, of course, people have different experiences. To some extent, their experiences depend on what they need. In other respects, their experiences depend on what they're able to accept or understand. And so I think that certainly many of them are based on Pythagoras's experiences. But then his students and successors, you know, they were also doing these types of spiritual practices. You might say mystical practices or theurgical practices, and you know, they had different experiences, and so they were doing observations and trying to understand them. So these things are difficult to understand because it's not normal experience, and even if you kind of grasp it, then it may be difficult to put into words. So you may have some insight into the structure of the divine realm, and then it's difficult to put it into words, and somebody else may put it into words differently. So that's why I say you know, I think we have to keep that in mind when we say, oh, you know, this one saw the first two principles as the monad and the dyad, but this one saw another principle above that. You know, um, Proclus thought there were henads, but other earlier Neoplatonists didn't know anything about henads. What are henads? You know, so they had different experiences, and they were trying to get an intellectual grasp on it. And I think part of the whole Pythagorean understanding of how we come to understand divinity is that we can't do it with our intellects. The intellect is not the highest portion of our mind. Above our the dianoia, the discursive reason, the kind of thing we're doing now, or that you do in your own head when you're thinking about stuff. That's a very important and a high aspect of our intellect, but it's not the highest aspect. Higher than that is the nous. And the nous is what allows us to directly grasp the Platonic forms, these eternal beings. And but because it's above the rational mind, it's difficult to put what it understands in words. Words are down at the level of the rational mind. This is above the level where words really work very well. And so even if somebody had a good grasp of it, it might be difficult to explain it. And so I think this is part of the reason we have these divergencies in the verbal descriptions. There are others too. I mean, part of it is that you have to understand some ancient philosophical texts as a kind of therapy of the word. What it's trying to do is change your way of thinking, transform your way of thinking. And so in that sense, just like a drug, it would be suited to the mental state of the person. And so you might give a different explanation to one person than to another person because they were in a different place, and or they needed a different kind of insight. And so if we understand that these, what we think of as philosophical texts, you know, that are either right or wrong, if we think of them as tools that were supposed to accomplish something in the mind of the student, then, you know, again, you know, different medicines for different people. That's why I say you can be overly picky about, well, Proclus said this, Iamblichus said that, which is right, you know, and lose the important insights that you get by worrying too much about the details. Now, you know, that's not to say, you know, you should throw out everything and just accept everything. But ultimately, of course, it's your own experience, you know, that is going to be best. But at least it can give you an idea what to look for, you know, and what sorts of experiences to try and seek out. So that's, you know, what I put in those articles and in the book was at that time reading texts from, loosely speaking, Pythagoreans, reading scholarly studies of the Pythagoreans and other philosophers that they followed, putting it together into some sort of coherent picture that made sense to me. And that's what I tried to do there.
It seems to me that spiritually we've come full circle. You stated that Pythagoras was in contact with shamans and he indulged in shamanic practices. And if you trace the development of the Western mystery tradition, it was all very elegant and abstract. You had people following grimoires and the like. But over the last few decades, shamanism has been rediscovered. And then you've got simplification of ceremonial magic in the form of chaos magic. So I'm not sure how you see the role of shamanism. Is it something that's revitalizing magical practice, or is it just a way of things coming back full circle?
I think it's a revitalization because I know for myself, in trying to understand the Pythagorean spiritual path, I've got insights from ethnographic studies of shamanism, from contemporary shamanism, from parallel traditions in other cultures. I think I mentioned before that I found Tibetan Buddhism very informative. Taoism, there was a time, probably about the time I wrote those articles, when I was reading Taoist texts in the morning and Pythagorean stuff in the evening, and I often got mixed up where I'd read something. There was enough underneath, of course, underneath a lot of the specifics and the cultural details, you could see a common structure. And I think that makes sense because we're all human beings. We're all interacting with the divine in essentially the same way, underneath a lot of the details, the technicalities. So, and I think, in the Western ceremonial magic tradition is that's one long tradition coming out of the Middle Ages and through the Renaissance and on into early modern Europe and so forth. I think, many people, many magicians, I will say, or people doing that type of work, are finding that it's also valuable. Especially, I think what has partly motivated this is there are people that like the idea, but they don't like the Golden Dawn, for example. Especially if they're maybe pagans, and the Golden Dawn seems too Christian for them. Then they may say, well, this makes a lot of sense, seems to work, but it just doesn't fit with my belief system very well. And so then they start exploring alternative systems and saying, well, what's going on here? What are we doing here with these ceremonies? What are we doing with these symbols? What are we doing with these mental exercises? What's the point of it all? And then you can begin to look at other cultures and also look at basically what's going on underneath. And I think a lot of people have done that in recent decades, and basically discovered, okay, there's sort of an underlying, I like to call it a technology, a spiritual technology underneath all of these things. And you can kind of do it up in whatever culture you want to a large extent. And I happen to follow the Greek tradition, which is very well documented and studied, but you can just as easily do it in many other traditions as well. And so I think maybe that's what's doing it. And it is I would call it a revitalization. It's not just going full circle because I don't know what I want to say most, but many people nowadays don't want to go sort of pure shamanism. That may be just a little too rough for them. but doing it in the context of some familiar or comfortable cultural context, I think works better for many people. But it is important to be able to see what's going on underneath so you can change things, you know? If something's not working very well, you say, okay, yeah, okay, that's not working very well, but I understand what's supposed to be, how it's supposed to be working, and I can take some ideas from another magical tradition or another spiritual tradition, and or something completely new. You know, we've learned a lot of psychology over the past several millennia. Do something completely new, but I understand now um, what I'm trying to do. I'm not just trying stuff randomly. I've got a understanding of the basic technology that's underneath, and I can apply that. So I think that's why I would call it a revitalization rather than just a return to 3,000 years ago.
Could you give us a brief summary of the importance of the ineffable one or first principle known as ion?
Right. And this is one of the things that some Pythagoreans disagree about. So the central to Pythagoreanism, of course, are the numbers, and in particular, the first few numbers. And many later Pythagoreans and Platonists as well focused on the monad and the dyad, the number one and the number two, as being the two principal forces, or two principles, I should say, of of everything, of all of the divine realms, because the monad is the principle of unity, what makes something one, and the dyad is the principle of difference, which makes things different. So with just the monad, you only got one thing. You require the dyad for there to be a multiplicity of things, a multiplicity of gods, for example, or a multiplicity of physical objects, a multiplicity of souls. The dyad is very essential to all of this. And, you know, these were often gendered as the monad was the father or a male of some sort, and the dyad was the mother or a female of some sort. That these two had to interact together in order to have an organized universe, a universe in which there were many things, but things also had commonalities. They were the same in some way, that there was some unity to them. Um, so this was a common idea in Middle Platonists, for example, and it fit very nicely with the sort of Pythagorean idea of the numbers. But then some philosophers, Plotinus was one of them, said, wait a minute, you know, if you've got two first principles, you've already got duality. You know, and so this we still haven't got to the most basic thing there can possibly be. And so this is where you get the idea of the one, tohen in ancient Greek, which stands above the monad and the dyad. And so this is the ultimate principle of unity. But this then becomes very problematic because the monad and the dyad, this is really the principle of being able to speak about things. It's the dyad is what makes possible discrimination between things, true and false, black and white, yes and no, male and female. Any sort of polarity depends on the dyad. And so anything you can talk about implies some sort of dichotomy, some sort of duality. And so if you're above the monad and the dyad, you really can't talk about it. So the way it's usually put is that the one is beyond being. So the level of being, it either is or it isn't. That's duality again. So we're beyond the level where we can have any sort of duality. So as they would say, does the one exist? It exists. It also doesn't exist, right? because we're beyond duality. So existence or non-existence, that's a duality. We're beyond duality. Is it one or is it many? Yes, both of them, because we're beyond duality. So what this means is that you cannot comprehensively talk about the one. And so it was called to areton hen, which means the unspeakable one or the inexpressible one. This term areton was also used for the mysteries. So it's unspeakable in the literal sense that you can't talk about it, but it's also unspeakable in the sense that it's not permitted to talk about it. So really the idea is this thing, which is beyond being and not being, beyond all duality, is something that really you shouldn't try and talk about because you can't talk about it. And any talk about it is going to be a misrepresentation. So this became the standard idea then in Neoplatonism, at least from Plotinus on, maybe a little earlier, because people said, well, yeah, there has to be this first principle, and you can't talk about it. Well, then, of course, there's the problem. Well, how do you know anything about it? If you can't speak about it, you can't write about it, you can't learn about it that way. And the answer is the only way you can get a grasp of it really is by uniting with it in some way. And that's where we get theurgical processes, the anagoge, the ascent, which is to try and ascend up through all of the levels of being, ultimately up to union with the unspeakable one. And in some way, again, not conceptually, because conceptual thinking is back at the level of duality, but in some way, by becoming the one, you begin to understand what the one is. Now, this, of course, is a common idea actually from many mystical traditions. This is that sort of sometimes described as an oceanic feeling where you feel a union with everything in existence. And so it's at least related to that idea. It's also related to ideas you find in many monotheistic religions, where the chief god or the prime or first god is something beyond your ability to talk about it. It's not a definite personality or something like that. It's some sort of ineffable first principle, where you can say what it's not, but you can't really say what it is, because again, that's pulling it back down again to the level of duality. So this is also why we get in Kabbalah is a good example, but also in polytheistic religions, the idea that this one then has a number of manifestations that are more specific, and you can talk to some degree, at least, about them. They're at a lower level, and ultimately they're at the level of this intuiting mind, the nous, which can grasp them individually, and then even at a lower level where you can talk about them in words, as for example in my book.
Mm. Your book contains an excellent chapter on theurgy, which you've been talking about, and you had a section in it on personal daemons. You wrote a guardian or personal daemon, as well as a shadow spirit or other daemon or bad daemon. And I was wondering, is this the origin of the popular representation of each of us having an angel on one shoulder and motivating us to do good, and a devil on the other shoulder tempting us to do evil?
Well, I think it's quite possible. Certainly for anyone who's read, ancient philosophy, Socrates had a daimonion that would give him advice, especially stop him from doing things he might otherwise be inclined to do. So I think that's a very common idea, and we find some pictures of these daimons on ancient pottery and things like that, and they look kind of like angels. They usually have wings, so I think the more common picture is probably just a Christianized version of that. But I think it reflects also a psychological insight. that we have these conflicting drives and influences and tendencies nudging us in often different directions. So I think even without maybe the philosophical background, people might have come up with that image.
You introduced the idea of our highest self, which Pythagoreans call the highest flower of the soul. And that's our inner daemon, which may or may not be the same as the guardian daemon. I was wondering what the relationship between this daemon and the holy guardian angel, or HGA, of ceremonial magic was.
Well, that's a good question. And it may depend exactly, as I mentioned in the book, people have different ideas of what your guardian daemon was in ancient Greece. And of course, there are different, I think, conceptions of what the holy guardian angel is as well, the HGA. From the Pythagorean perspective, your guardian spirit or guardian daemon is an independent being that is nevertheless with you during your life and between lives, between incarnations. And so in that sense, it's a separate being from you, but nevertheless, it's very closely related to you. So for example, it's in your head. So it knows your thoughts. It knows what's going on inside your head. You can't fool it. So in that sense, it's an intimate part of you. In a sense, it's got your best. It's got it's on your side, I guess is what I want to say. It's on your side, trying to ensure you that you get a good next incarnation, and that this one is good too. Now, the inmost flower of the soul, that's a little bit different, I think, at least as that's understood in later Neoplatonism. That's really the core of your psyche. Whereas the guardian spirit is a separate being in a sense, although closely related to you, this is in some sense the thing that is most you. And one way to view it is if you view your psyche, well, you view yourself as a microcosm, right? So you've got your body, which is kind of like the physical world, but in your body, or governing your body, you've got a soul. And that's kind of like the world soul. And in your nous, you've got images of the gods, the images of the gods that reside in the world nous, or the cosmic nous. And just as there is a cosmic one, ineffable one, there's an image of that in your psyche as well. So you have an individual image of it. And it, in some sense, represents the ultimate unity of you in the same way that the ineffable one represents the ultimate unity of the cosmos. And so this is what is most truly you. Our conscious minds are just another, from this perspective, another daimon that happens to live in our body. Okay, so our conscious mind is not running the show. It thinks it's running the show, and that's one of its big mistakes. So one of the things the conscious mind has to learn is it's not running the show. And so that means it wants to get in contact with who is running the show. And that's partly the images of the gods in our minds, but ultimately it's that image of the ineffable one inside of us, and that's the inmost flower of the soul. And so that's, just as we think about uniting with the one, the cosmic one, as being sort of an ascent, this is kind of a going inward, going into this inmost core of our being and uniting with it. And in that sense, by our conscious mind coming in contact with this inmost flower of the soul, it begins to understand better what is the true us and what is our our destiny, you might say. This is the star, you know, that's following its own course. And so my understanding, at least, of the HGA is that it is more like a guide. So in that sense, it's more like a guardian spirit, as the word would imply. And I would suspect, although I haven't tried to trace down the history, I would expect that the HGA, as it appears in ceremonial magic, for example, is probably a descendant of the guardian angel from the Platonic tradition, or the guardian spirit. And it's just been, you know, kind of Christianized and then brought into the ceremonial magic tradition. That's my guess, okay? Because just the fact that it's called a guardian angel, you know, all of the good diamonds got rebranded as angels. So the guardian spirit got rebranded as a guardian angel. And in fact, angel, angelos, is a Greek word, which is just one of the kinds of daimons. They were the announcers, you know, the ones that tended to bring messages from the gods. So, and in fact, if you look at catalogs of the different demonologies, we might say, from the Neoplatonists, the angeloi is just one class. There's the messengers. There's also protectors and purifiers and elevators. There's different jobs that the daimons have to do. So I think there's probably a difference there. My understanding of the HGA is you're not typically unifying with it. It's more, well, we say the conversation with your HGA, right? So it's more of a still, there's two beings involved there. And I would almost say, I know you're interested in also talking about muses and figures like that. In some ways, the HGA is a psychopomp, right? It's a soul guide. And in some ways, it might be similar to other soul guides within the Platonic tradition or the Pythagorean tradition, which again is different from that inmost flower of the soul.
I tend to agree with you. I see the HGA as being separate from us, but over the last few decades, there's been this movement within ceremonial magic where some will see it as a higher self, an aspect of ourselves. So it's something that's a part of us rather than something that's separate from us. But anyway, I mean, there's confusion. No one quite knows. I was just interested to hear your take. In your book, you wrote that our guardian daemon and shadow daemon usually have the same gender as we do. And I was wondering whether that gender also applied to the higher self. And the reason why I'm asking is that in Sufi poetry, the higher self is usually portrayed as the opposite gender to us.
Well, I think this has a lot to do with what you consider to be your higher self. And really, there are various notions of higher self. So, for example, I talked about the rational mind and consciousness. Well, that's probably our most common notion of what our self is. And so one notion of the higher self is this nous, you know, where we're going beyond the level of rational thought to some sort of direct intuitive grasp of the Platonic ideas or Platonic forms. And so that's one sense. If we're kind of moving up into that realm of the psyche, that is one notion of a higher self. So if we think of this in terms of levels, you know, the Plato had this tripartite soul, where it's sort of the belly, the heart, and the brain. That's a level of rational thought, but really above that is the nous. But the nous in our heads corresponds to the cosmic nous. That's the realm where the Platonic forms exist. That's where the gods exist. And so above that is this ineffable one. And so if you want to use sort of the vertical analogy, above the nous, each of us also has this inner one, this inner ineffable one. And that's the inmost flower of the soul. It's just the metaphor is different. It's up here instead of inside us somewhere. And so so I think that is probably genderless. Although I don't know. It's probably genderless, but I don't know, because in some sense it's the totality of us, which, and by being a totality, it includes all of the various opposites. So if we have a male gender, well, that means that in some sense, in our conscious lives and in our emotional lives and many other respects, we've adopted sort of the male aspects of that, which means the female aspects have been set aside. They've been buried, or they've been just set aside. And so the self has to have all of those things. And so in some sense, I suspect the self, or this inmost flower of the soul, is probably genderless. That would fit the common conception of that is beyond duality, right? Now, what about the Sufi higher self? I'm not an expert on Sufism by a long shot, but my guess is that what they're calling the higher self, at least when it's gendered opposite to the conscious mind, is probably a psychopomp. And our psychopomps, our soul guides, are often the opposite gender to us. Now, why is that? Well, probably, this is getting very speculative here, but probably it's because their job is to introduce us to deities, aspects of our psyche, ways of being that are different from what our conscious mind has adopted and that our whole life has adopted, really. And so they are often complementary to us in many respects. And so that would mean they're complementary to sort of our conscious gender. That's one explanation for why they are often of the opposite gender. So this is why muses, especially for male poets, for example, are often female. But again, you'd expect it to be the opposite for women artists, for example, because it's trying to lead us to things that we've in some way rejected or left behind. Okay, ways of viewing things, ways of understanding things, ways of dealing with things, and so that's part of the unification process, is to introduce us to these other things, and that's why a soul guide, where they're leading us, is to these other realms that we've neglected. And so they're, one guide along the way towards that unification with the inmost flower of the soul, or with the ineffable one. But they're more complementary to our conscious psyche. So my guess is, especially because so much Sufi poetry is so erotic, that there's often a sexual relationship that's implied there, and that's more typical of a soul guide than of a relation to the inmost core of yourself, which again, by its nature, almost has to be beyond gender. Like I said, I don't claim any great expertise in Sufism, but I do think that's why, in the Christian tradition, you find people like Saint Teresa and Hildegard of Bingen having relationships with Jesus. Well, Jesus is their soul guide, but again, he's opposite gender to them, and so it is a natural sort of guide for them.
And further to that, even to this day, nuns become brides of Christ. We're starting to run out of time, but there are two questions I wanted to ask you. So because I think that they're quite important. So have to keep it really brief. So first question is, you wrote that the discovery of the four elements is generally credited to Empedocles, who was familiar with the ancient mystery traditions, including the Orphic mysteries of the underworld, mysteries of Hecate, Demeter, Persephone, and Dionysus. I was wondering how much wisdom from the mystery traditions is encoded in the four elements.
Well, I think there's probably a great deal. I think, the four elements, especially as Empedocles and later philosophers explain them, they're not just, the materials, earth, air, fire, and water. They're metaphysical principles. Um, and they're based in particular, and this is getting back to sort of Pythagoreanism, on two polarities, the polarity of warm versus cool and the polarity of wet versus dry. So you get this fourfold structure from these two polarities. I didn't mention it, but the Pythagoreans were very much about opposites. They had a whole table of opposites, and they viewed things in terms of these polarities. And so this is fundamental to our thinking. And so we find many of these polarities in the mysteries, life and death, right? Male and female. These things were very important in the mysteries. So I think, especially when people started trying to conceptualize the mysteries more, these ideas got tied up together. All of these philosophers were initiated into the mysteries. I mean, we know in many cases they were initiated in the Eleusinian mysteries, but also their biographies basically say they went around the whole Mediterranean being initiated into all of the mysteries. So they had all of these ideas. They couldn't talk about them directly, though, but they could talk about them allegorically. With care. um, and so I think this is something we also have to understand, that in these teachings, especially the ones that have come down to us, there's a lot of winks and nods to the people that had been initiated and would see deeper meaning in what was being discussed. And what we're trying to do is pull out some of this deeper meaning as well, and as best we can.
Exactly. So, of the four elements, it seems that the most important one is fire, as it's the primary agent of transformation and it represents the power to impose a self-determining form. You stated that the application of fire, quote, provides an escape from the cycle of reincarnation and a passage to the Isles of the Blessed, end quote.
I said that, huh? Well, I mean, we see that in many of the stories. So the one I think I was talking about there was Empedocles. There's a lots of wild stuff that's said about him. Again, he's considered a philosopher, and he came up with the four elements. Sounds like pretty scientific stuff, but the guy was known for curing plagues. For doing magic. And the story of his death was that he climbed up Mount Etna behind me here, and jumped into the crater, and that's the way he died. And which is certainly a dramatic enough story. But then what raises it to the level of absurdity is that supposedly the volcano then belched out a bronze sandal. Now, why? Why one bronze sandal? And this is stuff that Peter Kingsley in particular, I think, is very well ferreted out. Bronze was a symbol of Hecate. A single sandal was a very common sign of somebody who had some connection with the underworld. And this was basically, if you like, Mount Etna, or at least the storyteller, telling us that Empedocles didn't just commit suicide by jumping into a volcano. In fact, he was returning to the underworld through or Sicily was considered filled with entrances to the underworld, all these volcanic clefts. And so it was a natural place to go. It was, there were temples to Persephone. Um, so a very place very much connected with the fiery underworld. So this really connects with alchemical ideas, that the transformation of a person to a higher state of being, psychological led into psychological gold, or spiritual led into spiritual gold, was largely a process that happened by a process of through fire. Now, not necessarily through real fire. So again, we've got symbolism here. He jumped into the crater, and krater in ancient Greek, means a mixing bowl. It's the bowl where you mix the wine and the water, right? So he's jumping into fluid fire to be transformed uh, into his next state. And the story about Empedocles was they had been reincarnated many times, and this was his last reincarnation. He was escaping from the wheel, and he was at a stage now where he could do that. He could transform himself into a being that would not be reincarnated anymore. And so that's, I think, what that whole story symbolizes. But in general, especially if you view this in an alchemical context, which we have to remember also, alchemy began in ancient Egypt, but also was very well known in ancient Greece. That this is a symbolization of, again, this transformational process, very much mediated by heat. You would cook things very slowly to transform them. You would distill them. Heat is the power that separates things. So separating the body from the soul, from the higher soul, that would be an alchemical process that we could think of as a kind of distillation, which then you could bring that higher soul back down again into the body. And so that's, I think, the notion in which heat is essential, or fire is essential to that process of transformation. But also dissolution is part of it. And, this is part of reuniting the opposites. Fire and water are opposites. And so there has to be some sense in which the dissolution caused by water and the transformation caused by fire are brought together in some way, either cyclically or in some higher union of the two. And I think we find, these unions of again, fire is associated with the monad, water with the dyad. So again, we're how to get above those two principles to the ultimate union beyond them. But there's lots of stories, about people being boiled in pots to be rejuvenated or to be reincarnated in Greek mythology. So I think it's a common symbolic idea that you, by cooking the person, hopefully symbolically, you can in some way rejuvenate them and bring them back to life, or bring them into a better form. The homunculus, that the alchemists talked about, the little person, it's really the soul of the person brought into a more perfect form. And the theurgists thought it was very important to refine the soul vehicle to enable theurgy to take place. So not so much the physical body, but the vehicle of the soul, which connects the soul to the physical body, had to be refined. And it's just like you refine ore. It's refining this soul vehicle. So there's a lot of symbolic connections there, and maybe even some actual physiological connections as well.
Susan, you've been awfully quiet. Do you have any comments or questions before we wrap this up?
I loved it, listening to both of you talk about these things. The power of the numbers really resonated with me. I remember reading Crowley's 0=2 essay, and it talks about having like two opposites, and then when you cancel them both out, you're left with this big, beautiful zero, the 0 to the 0 degree. And so a lot of that is kind of where that inner peace comes from. Also, the idea of silence, of knowing and almost not being able to explain. It's hard going and putting things into words at times. And like you said, everybody's experience is valid. Throughout all these years, we've all been trying to experience God, and how does that come forth? So yeah, just an amazing interview. I'm always inspired on the Living Hellenismos podcast. Once again, thank you all so much. Thanks to Hercules, Apollonius. It's been such a joy to get to know you better and to listen to you talk. And of course, my beloved Tony. So yeah, great interview, guys. Absolutely loved it.
Thank you.
Okay, but before we end, I was wondering, Apollonius, are there any current projects that you're engaged in, and how can people contact you to find out more about you?
Okay, so yeah, I'll very quickly. I'm beginning work on. Well, I've got translations of some new ancient Greek oracle systems. I think I mentioned to Tony. I mentioned them to you before. And I hope to be producing a book with those next over the next few.
PGM.
Excuse me. Yes, one of them is in a partial text in the PGM, and so I've got the as full of text as we've got. It's better than the PGM text, and also a lot of explanatory material to help you use it, and then the Homer Oracle as well. With again a lot of explanatory material, so I've got that. I'll be putting together in the next few months. I've also got a project I've just finished. I'll be putting it, publishing it as a book any day now. That's a new divination system I actually sort of created based on some other ideas, but it doesn't make any claim to being an ancient divination system. But it's based on my insights into how those work, and so that's something that works with numbers, and I'll be publishing that any day now. I'm just in the final stages of proofreading. So it's called the Wilkins Noemamantia, mouthful. The Noema ideas, and Mantea is oracle. So I'll let you know about that any day now.
Please, it's
How to get a hold of me? My website is opsopaus.com, opsopaus.com, and you can email me. You can find out information about all of these books that are out at least. And I'll be presenting at WitchCon and at Mystic South. I'll put up some information about that over the next few months.
very cool. So Apollonius, thank you so much for coming on the show and letting us get to know you a little bit better. I wish you success. Well, Susan does as well. So Susan and I both wish you success with all your future endeavors. So good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.